In the heart of Harmony Chapel, nestled on the outskirts of a quiet town, Pastor Elijah stood as a beacon of faith and morality. Known for his passionate sermons and unwavering devotion to his congregation, he was admired by all. But beneath the surface of his picturesque life, a storm was brewing, one that no amount of prayer could calm. His wife, Miriam, was equally admired. With her radiant smile and melodious voice, she was the church's songbird, leading worship every Sunday. She was the perfect complement to Pastor Elijah, or so everyone believed. But lately, her smile had grown distant, her eyes carrying a secret even the most discerning among the flock couldn't decipher. Enter Nathaniel Cross, the charismatic gospel singer with a voice that could silence a storm. Nathaniel had been invited to Harmony Chapel for a month-long revival, a series of evening services meant to ignite the congregation's faith. His arrival was marked by a surge of excitement among the members, especially the women, who couldn't help but admire his charm. From the moment Miriam and Nathaniel met, there was an unspoken tension between them. It started innocently enough, an extended glance here, a fleeting touch there. They often rehearsed together for the evening services, their harmonies blending so perfectly it felt as though they were made to sing together. But soon, the rehearsals stretched longer than necessary. One evening, after the congregation had dispersed, Miriam lingered in the empty chapel. Nathaniel was still at the piano, playing a soft, haunting tune. Miriam approached him, her heart pounding. "That's beautiful," she said, her voice trembling. Nathaniel looked up, his eyes locking with hers. "It's inspired," he replied, his voice low. "Somehow, this place, everything seems to be." Miriam should have walked away, but instead, she sat beside him on the bench. The air between them grew thick with unspoken words. And then it happened, a kiss. Brief, electric, and completely wrong. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments. They convinced themselves it was harmless, that it was just music drawing them together. But deep down, both knew they were crossing a line. Unbeknownst to them, Sister Beatrice, the church's unofficial watchdog, had begun to notice Miriam's frequent absences and Nathaniel's sudden interest in late-night rehearsals. One evening, curiosity got the better of her, and she lingered outside the chapel after hours. What she saw left her clutching her Bible tighter than ever. The next morning, the whispers began. Sister Beatrice wasn't one to let secrets lie dormant. By dawn, the whispers of what she had seen were making their way through the congregation. She didn't confront Miriam or Nathaniel directly, instead, she planted seeds of suspicion with a carefully chosen word here, a raised eyebrow there. "Have you noticed how much time Miriam spends at the chapel after hours?" she asked Deacon Harold as they prepared for morning prayer. "And that Nathaniel, such a gifted singer, but don't you think he's a bit too friendly?" By Sunday, the undercurrent of gossip had reached a fever pitch, though no one dared speak openly about the pastor's wife. Harmony Chapel was a small church, after all, and tongues wagged faster than hymns could be sung. Meanwhile, Miriam and Nathaniel carried on, oblivious to the storm gathering around them. Their stolen moments had grown more daring, a lingering touch during worship practice, a shared laugh in the shadows of the vestry. Each encounter fueled a dangerous fire, and though guilt nipped at Miriam's conscience, the pull she felt toward Nathaniel was undeniable. One evening, as they sat in Nathaniel's car parked in a secluded corner of the church grounds, Miriam let out a shaky breath. "We can't keep doing this," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," Nathaniel replied, reaching for her hand. "But it's like I can't stop thinking about you. You make me feel alive, Miriam." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She knew it was wrong, knew she was playing with fire, but for the first time in years, she felt seen. Pastor Elijah, for all his virtues, had grown distant over the years, consumed by his ministry and the weight of his responsibilities. Miriam had become an afterthought in their marriage, a silent partner to his holy mission. That night, as Miriam crept back into the house she shared with Elijah, she found him at his desk, poring over his sermon notes. He looked up, his eyes weary but kind. "You're home late," he said, his tone neutral. "I stayed to help Nathaniel with some arrangements for the revival," she replied, her voice steady despite the knot of guilt tightening in her chest. Elijah nodded, returning his attention to his notes. Miriam lingered in the doorway, watching him. She wondered if he had noticed the growing distance between them, if he cared enough to try and bridge it. The next day, the rumors reached Pastor Elijah. Sister Beatrice approached him after service, her tone dripping with concern. "Pastor, I feel compelled to share something. It may be nothing, but," she paused dramatically, drawing him in. "There's been talk about Miriam and Brother Nathaniel. You know how people can be, but I thought you should hear it from me first." Elijah's jaw tightened, though he kept his expression calm. "Thank you for your concern, Sister Beatrice. I'll handle it." That evening, Elijah watched Miriam closely as she hummed softly in the kitchen, her movements graceful and unhurried. He wanted to believe the rumors were just that, baseless talk. But doubt had crept into his heart, and it refused to leave. Meanwhile, Nathaniel began to sense the growing tension in the air. Members of the congregation who once greeted him warmly now offered tight smiles or avoided his gaze altogether. It wasn't long before he realized their secret was no longer as hidden as they believed. And then came the revival's final night, an event meant to be the crowning glory of Nathaniel's stay at Harmony Chapel. The sanctuary was packed, the air electric with anticipation. Miriam stood at the front, her hands trembling as she gripped the microphone. Nathaniel was beside her, his voice soaring as he led the congregation in worship. But as the last note faded, Pastor Elijah stepped forward, his presence commanding. He looked out at the congregation, then turned his gaze to Miriam and Nathaniel. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "tonight, we celebrate the power of redemption. But before we do, I must address a matter that weighs heavily on my heart." A hush fell over the congregation. The only sound was the faint rustling of programs as Pastor Elijah paused, his hands gripping the pulpit. Miriam froze where she stood, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Nathaniel, beside her, shifted uncomfortably, his confident demeanor faltering under Elijah's piercing gaze. "Over the past weeks, our church has been blessed by the incredible talents of Brother Nathaniel," Elijah said, his voice calm but deliberate. "His voice has stirred our spirits, and his presence has strengthened our fellowship. Yet, as your shepherd, it is my duty to ensure the purity and integrity of this sanctuary remain intact." Miriam's breath caught in her throat. She felt the weight of every eye in the room on her, though Elijah hadn't named names yet. "There are rumors," Elijah continued, his tone measured but sharp, "whispers of impropriety among us. I won't name those involved, but I'll say this: God sees all. He knows what is done in the light and in the shadows. And to those who may have strayed, I offer this: there is grace for repentance, but there must also be accountability." The congregation murmured, heads turning subtly toward Miriam and Nathaniel. Miriam gripped the edge of the podium, her knuckles white, as the weight of Elijah's words bore down on her. Elijah stepped back from the pulpit, his face unreadable. "Let us bow our heads in prayer," he said. As the congregation lowered their heads, Miriam's mind raced. She knew Elijah's words were a warning, a plea for her to come clean. But the humiliation of confessing her sins in front of the entire church felt unbearable. After the service, Elijah waited in his office, knowing Miriam would come to him. She always did after he preached, a tradition born from their early years together when they'd review the night sermon as partners. But tonight, the silence stretched. Miriam finally entered, her steps hesitant. She closed the door behind her, avoiding his eyes. "That was quite the sermon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but firm. Miriam, do you have something you need to tell me? She swallowed hard, her hands trembling. I don't know what you mean. Elijah's jaw tightened, the patience in his gaze giving way to something colder. Don't insult me, Miriam. The congregation may only have suspicions, but I know my wife. I've known something was wrong for weeks. Her eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. The silence between them was deafening. Is it true? He asked, his voice quieter now. You are Nathaniel. Miriam looked away, her tears spilling over. I didn't mean for it to happen, Elijah. I was lonely. You've been so consumed with the church, with everyone else, I felt invisible. Elijah's face twisted with a mix of anger and pain. And instead of coming to me, you turned to him. In God's house, Miriam. It wasn't like that, she cried. I didn't plan this. I didn't. Elijah raised a hand, silencing her. He stood, pacing the room, his mind racing. You've put me in an impossible position. The people trust me to lead them, to set an example. How am I supposed to stand in that pulpit knowing this? Miriam sobbed, her shoulders shaking. I'm sorry, Elijah. I never wanted to hurt you. He stopped pacing, his back to her. We'll have to deal with this, Miriam. Quietly, for the sake of the church. But Nathaniel has to leave. Tonight. Miriam's heart sank. She knew Nathaniel's departure would raise more questions, but she also knew Elijah was right. And us, she asked, her voice trembling. What happens to us? Elijah turned to face her, his eyes filled with a pain she'd never seen before. That depends on you, Miriam. On whether you're willing to make things right, or if this was never meant to last. Meanwhile, Nathaniel sat alone in his hotel room, a suitcase open on the bed. The weight of what had transpired hung heavy over him. He knew the revival was over, not just the services, but the bond he'd formed with Miriam. As he prepared to leave Harmony Chapel for good, a knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Miriam standing there, her face pale and streaked with tears. I told Elijah, she said, her voice breaking. He knows everything. Nathaniel's heart sank. And now? I don't know, she whispered. But I had to see you, one last time. Nathaniel stepped aside, letting Miriam into the room. The tension between them was thick, both knowing this was likely the last time they'd be alone together. Miriam stood by the window, staring out at the dimly lit parking lot, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold together the pieces of her crumbling world. I don't know what to do, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah wants you gone tonight. He's furious, but he didn't say whether he'd forgive me. Nathaniel sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together. Miriam, this, whatever we have, it was wrong. But it wasn't meaningless to me. I care about you, more than I should. But maybe it's time to stop running from the consequences. She turned to face him, her eyes red and filled with tears. I don't want to lose you, Nathaniel. But I can't lose my family either. My boys, they are too young to understand any of this. Nathaniel's heart broke at her words. He stood and crossed the room, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. You need to fight for your marriage, Miriam. If Elijah's willing to give you a chance, take it. For your family. For yourself. I'll leave. Maybe that'll make it easier for you to fix things. She shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her face. You make it sound so simple, but it's not. Nothing about this is simple. It never is, he said softly. But I can't stay here and make things worse for you. You deserve a chance to make things right, even if it means we never see each other again. The words hung heavy in the air. Miriam wanted to protest, to beg him to stay, But deep down, she knew he was right. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She picked it up and saw Elijah's name flashing on the screen. Her chest tightened as she answered.